They had been told that capture meant certain death. They had been told that if American soldiers found them, they would be mistreated, raped daily, starved, and killed. However, when Japanese women were taken prisoner in the final days of World War II, what happened next completely stunned them. Watch the video to the end to find out why. In the chaotic final months of World War II, the Japanese Empire was collapsing on Pacific islands such as Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa. The once mighty Japanese army had been reduced to scattered groups of soldiers and civilians, most of whom were women. These were nurses, clerks, and volunteers from the Women's Auxiliary Corps, some barely out of their teens. They had lived for years under strict imperial orders. After dishonor came the other world. Every speech, every school book taught them that surrendering to the Americans meant shame and regret. The propaganda machine portrayed the enemy as monsters and barbarians who would rape, mistreat, and kill every woman who fell into their hands. This was a powerful message engraved in everyone's heart. If capture was inevitable, the other world was preferred. And most people believed this completely. Therefore, as U.S. forces advanced across the islands, with the roar artillery fire drawing closer each day, most of these women prepared for the worst. Some hid in caves, clutching grenades or knives, waiting for the enemy to arrive. Others silently wept, believing their fate had already been sealed. They had heard the stories, exaggerations, and rumors that had spread throughout years of war. To them, American soldiers were merciless, faceless monsters. Then, the day of capture arrived. When American patrols reached the caves and shelters where the women were hiding, the women's reaction was one of utter dread. Most of the women screamed or tried to run away. Some bowed their heads so low that their foreheads touched the ground, wishing to be killed rather than captured. Others froze completely, unable to speak or move, awaiting the horror they had been promised. But what happened next was the exact opposite of what they had been told. The American troops lowered their weapons. Instead of shouting or hitting them, they called for an interpreter. They spoke calmly, gesturing with open hands. They offered water. Some even handed out food packages, canned food, pieces of chocolate, and even cigarettes. When a woman fainted from exhaustion, a medic ran to help her. There was no anger, cruelty, or mockery on their faces. And most shockingly, they did not touch them. They did not even deign to do so because their purpose was different. The American troops kept a respectful distance, speaking gently through translators, ensuring the women were safe and treated properly. They gave them blankets, guided them to medical tents, and made sure they were fed. The women were too stunned to believe it. Some waited, trembling, expecting the kindness to turn into something terrible, but it never did. For many of these women, this moment shattered years of fear and indoctrination. Everything they had been told about the Americans was being disproven in front of their eyes. When the captured women were later moved to prisoner of war camps, the same discipline continued. The camps were run under the Geneva Convention, and the rules were clear. Prisoners, regardless of gender, were to be treated humanely. In the United States and Allied bases in the Pacific, military police enforced these rules with precision. Guards were instructed to show restraint and professionalism.
To the Japanese women who had grown up in a culture that expected brutality from conquerors, it was incomprehensible. They were given medical examinations, new clothes, soap, and food. Some were even allowed to write letters home, though few had families left to contact. They were housed separately from male prisoners and monitored by female nurses or Red Cross workers. At mealtime, American officers ensured that the women received the same rations as male POWs. It was a world away from the horror stories they had been told. In their own army, the treatment of captives had been harsh. The Japanese military code viewed surrender as weakness, so enemy prisoners were often treated with contempt or worse. These women had seen that firsthand. And now, to find themselves on the opposite side of that equation, being treated with dignity by the very men they had been raised to hate, was deeply confusing. Some of the women began to talk quietly amongst themselves in the camps. They spoke about their families, about what they had believed, about how different the Americans seemed from the monsters in their government's propaganda. One woman later wrote that the first time she saw an American soldier look away politely as she washed clothes near a stream, she began to cry. It was a simple act of decency, but one that felt like a revelation. Days turned into weeks, and the fear began to fade. The soldiers guarding them became familiar faces. A few learned small English words. "Thank you. Water, please." Some of the younger American guards, barely older than the women themselves, smiled awkwardly when they passed. There was no hostility, no cruelty, just order and discipline. For many of the prisoners, that quiet respect broke them emotionally. They had spent years believing that the Americans were devils, yet these same men showed compassion even after all that had happened. The bombings, the loss, the hatred. It was something the women couldn't explain, and for some, it sparked a lifelong reflection on everything they had been taught. When the war finally ended, and the women were repatriated back to Japan, they returned to a country in ruins. Many had no homes to go back to, but they carried with them memories that would stay for the rest of their lives. The memory of how their enemies had treated them, not as spoils of war, but as people. Some spoke about it decades later, quietly in interviews or memoirs. They described the confusion
they felt when American soldiers gave them food instead of punishment, or when guards saluted before speaking to them. They said that small gestures of respect did more to change their view of the world than any speech or policy ever could. Their stories became symbols of how human decency can survive even in times of unimaginable destruction. These women had been raised to believe that mercy was weakness, that surrender was disgrace, that the enemy was beyond redemption. But the men who captured them proved the opposite, that strength can come from restraint, and that honor can exist even in the heart of war. When they were told to line up for processing, no one laid a hand on them. When they were given food, no one demanded anything in return. When they were asked questions, they were treated with courtesy. To people who had lived through years of total war, where cruelty was expected and mercy rare, it was the most shocking thing imaginable. And so, for those Japanese women prisoners, the most unforgettable moment was not the end of the war, not their release, not even their return home. It was the realization that the men they had feared the most, the men they had been taught to hate, had shown them compassion instead of mistreatment. It was a lesson that transcended nationality and politics. It was proof that even after years of hatred, the human heart is still capable of kindness. They came to believe that true victory does not belong to the side that destroys more, but to the side that chooses not to. And that choice, to show respect, to treat the enemy with dignity, became one of the quietest, yet most powerful acts of the entire war. Subscribe for more true World War II stories.